research biologist. She has an MS in natural resource geography and a PhD in fisheries from Oregon State University. Her research explores holistic approaches to catchment analysis and management, and she's particularly interested in relationships between disturbance processes and aquatic habitat. And there you saw by my picture, she is an energetic field worker. Let's hear from you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed Mark's presentation. That was an ideal way to transition into this talk about passive restoration. And what is passive restoration, and why on earth would you ever possibly consider using or implementing this type of a restoration technique? So before I get started, I want to acknowledge a lot of the folks whose ideas and work have contributed to some of the analysis that is presented, and a lot of the great discussions with all these folks as well. So we're all really familiar with photos and sites where in-stream restoration has or is being implemented. So images of workers in streams are common, sometimes highly engineered solutions that appear like a landscape park are shown as a restoration action. You know, we often see photos of practitioners next to before and after scenes with with work. And often there are the Bob the Builder, big yellow construction equipment that's part of active restoration. And sometimes out here, there's even helicopters. So when we start to think about restoration over the last several decades, many of the ideas and approaches that we've taken over time have changed. So back in the 90s, when folks were first starting to really experiment, at least out here in the Pacific Northwest with restoration, it was really anchored structures trying to engineer very specific outcomes. And that's transitioned more recently into mobile work with limited anchoring or process-based restoration like Mark was talking about. But why on earth would we do restoration anyway? Oh, I just remembered I need to start my timer. There. So why would we do stream restoration anyway? Some of the cynical people out there might say that we do stream restoration work because we were forced to. So back in the 1990s, a lot of federally listed species started to be identified across the country. And those management agencies that really needed to be involved in the management of these species started to recognize in greater detail what was wrong with our streams and how we needed to improve them. So I would also say that slightly less cynical people would say that we do stream restoration because it's an incredible opportunity to right a wrong that's been done to our stream systems, that allows for varied stakeholders to come together with a shared goal and a mission, which helps create a more holistic environment for us all to understand our impact on our rivers and streams. Nowhere was the move towards active restoration more pronounced, I think, than you'll find in the Pacific Northwest, where huge amounts of money from hydropower remediation, as well as from state and federal agencies, fueled the development of a restoration economy. So this is an example from Puget Sound, where nearly $40 million has been slated for restoration projects between 2021 and 2023. So this is the current project for this particular effort. But this talk isn't supposed to be about active restoration, right? It's about passive restoration. So what is passive restoration anyway? So passive restoration is essentially restoration that is designed to remove anthropogenic disturbances and allow systems to recover on their own. So for those who want a more immediate fix, or who have lots of restoration dollars to spend, passive restoration may be perceived as taking too long or to be utterly hopeless. And in some instances, and in some cases, they're right. You know, a barrier culvert isn't going to replace itself, at least not until a massive landslide takes out the whole road, including that culvert. But there are strong arguments that are being made now that in order to change the trajectory of floodplain development, particularly for incised systems, intensive restoration that is necessary. But with so many stream miles altered across the country, active restoration is likely not going to be the most cost-effective solution everywhere. So an important question is, why would we select passive restoration? So passive restoration may be a good choice when the area of interest is vastly too large for a targeted restoration project. Similarly, when the goal of the restoration is watershed scale rather than site or reach scale, passive restoration may be an option to consider. In both of these situations, disturbance from the restoration or the cost from active restoration is prohibitive. There are also situations when passive restoration is simply the best choice due to management goals and conditions. So a few types of common things that I consider to be passive restoration, others may not. But one is some of the protective measures that we often take, such as riparian buffer strips or even grazing exclosures. Both of these types of applications of management are ensuring that some element of process is restored or enhanced in a stream, whether it's riparian zones filtering sediment and nutrients, or with grazing exclosures that often are designed to allow for vegetative recovery. We also see changes in terrestrial land management can be a form of passive restoration. And allowing disturbance events to occur, I think, is another form of passive restoration. And this is what makes passive restoration not passive at all. Passive restoration relies on change, and change is often linked to disturbance. So one of the types of passive restoration methods, the techniques that I just mentioned, could be considered riparian buffers. And I wanted to share this study by a student of mine a few years back. And he looked at all of the different types of riparian buffers in watersheds along the Oregon Coast Range. And many of these buffers are designed specifically to protect streams for salmon habitat. And what he found was that the most restrictive buffers didn't occur in the same places that our fish were on the landscape. So if we're going to try to implement these broad scale types of efforts that are a passive way for us to restore or maintain stream habitat, it's likely useful for us to think about where these buffers are on the landscape and where the species are that we're also interested in trying to protect. This paper by Morrison and Lindell did a nice job looking at how passive restoration in forested and degraded tropical environments could result in recovery of systems in a way that was comparable to active restoration. And so they found that while the vegetative recovery was faster in places where you had active restoration, the community of insects and the foraging behavior of the birds, which were the goals of either active or passive restoration, they both occurred at the same rate. So in this case, you could have the same outcome. It might not look quite the same using passive methods as opposed to active methods. This is another study by Hansen and Goody in 2011, and they were evaluating cattle exposures and the effect of those exposures on stream water quality, chemistry, temperature, and the presence of whirling disease in cutthroat trout. We were hoping to see the cattle exposures would allow for restoration that reduced disease in trout. And what they found was that over the relatively short period of the study, which was from 2004 to 2008, the interannual variability in environmental conditions really confounded their ability to detect the restoration response that they wanted. They did find that the vegetation response was quick, but being able to translate that into a biological response in the trout took longer. That was similar to some results by Hugh Snee and co-authors in 2013. And they found that longer term monitoring is incredibly important for passive restoration, because passive restoration takes time, which is a comment that Mark had, a message that Mark had for us in the previous presentation as well. So natural processes of scour and deposition that are day-to-day events in seasonal patterns of flood and drought in rivers deliver the building blocks for complex habitat for both active and passive restoration. So disturbance processes are part of the rejuvenation cycle that is necessary to maintain habitat. But these processes are often suppressed or mitigated for after events such as large floods, or landslides, or wildfire. Passive restoration may be an ideal choice in places that are inherently dynamic and where disturbance processes, as well as hydrogeomorphic processes, are still active. So in Oregon's Coast Range, in this particular project, we mapped deep-seated landslides and found that the connection distance between seasonal habitats, coho salmon, were really short in the same locations that we saw deep-seated landslides. So deep-seated landslides are ancient, but they are active earth movements that can affect entire mountainsides. And they essentially push the floodplain over and contribute consistent amounts of habitat building sediments to streams. So these types of locations, if they can be identified on a landscape, could be really prime locations for some types of passive restoration, because because the processes and some of the mechanisms are in place for natural processes to occur in these locations. So I've been saying an important element of passive restoration is the assumption that the system will change over time, and that this change will result eventually in improved habitat conditions. But what is sometimes forgotten, overlooked is that events like wildfires or volcanoes, I mean, these can be really enormous events that take centuries in some cases to recover from, or small processes associated with our stream engineers like beavers, which can affect hydrology and the geomorphic configuration of habitats and the riparian composition of streams. So disturbance processes can range from these massive events to these smaller types of effects that we see in systems. But all of these disturbances modify habitats and over time result in a mosaic of stream habitat conditions with varying stages of maturity and productivity for aquatic species. All of these changes, though, rely on time and the assumption that streams are not static. So in this way, passive restoration, like I said before, isn't passive at all. It relies on active change events. So passive restoration is just patient. I'd like to transition now to what I think is possibly one of the largest passive restoration experiments that's happening in the US. I'm calling it an experiment. Others call it a plan. So this would be the 24.5 million acres of federal land that's associated with the Northwest Forest Plan. The Northwest Forest Plan developed in response to the listing of several species of birds and fish in the 1990s. And it was the absence of old growth trees and the lack of intact aquatic habitats that were identified as severe limiting issues for the survival of spotted owls and murrelets and for various species of Pacific salmon. So the response to this was the largest management plan in US Forest Service history that encompasses forests from the Canadian border nearly to San Francisco. The goal was to protect the long-term health of forests, wildlife, and waterways, and it focused on scientifically sound and ecologically predictable responses. And one of the primary mechanisms within this Northwest Forest Plan for change was to shift management away from timber harvest to an absence of timber harvest. The outcome of the plan was a near virtual end for timber harvest on federal lands throughout this region. So there was an aquatic conservation strategy for the Northwest Forest Plan, and the primary objective of that, the aquatic conservation strategy, was to maintain and restore the distribution, complexity, and diversity of watershed level features. But what's really important when we think about this as a passive restoration strategy is that there's a long-term goal associated with this, anticipating that we aren't going to achieve that primary objective for 100 years, that the development of a network of functioning watersheds that have processes that are intact enough to support aquatic and riparian dependent organisms is going to take a long time to happen. And the goal in this was to try to understand how conditions within watersheds would change, hopefully trying to transition to a positive improvement in overall scores, but recognizing that there's going to be variability in condition across all of the watersheds and areas within this plan area. And one of the things that is really important for this plan is long-term monitoring. And that includes environmental DNA, which has been incorporated in recent years, but long-term data sets of macrovertebrate abundance and distribution, as well as in-stream habitat surveys and remotely sensed data to help us understand how forest condition and such is changing over the timeline of this plan. So a couple things about the Northwest Forest Plan. There are 4 management categories. I'm going to refer to them in the next couple slides, so I wanted to define them. So one is that you have reserved lands. So these are reserved through congressional designation or in local forest plans. There are late successional reserves. So these are the old growth areas where we're not supposed to do any kind of active work at all. Matrix land where active timber management can occur, and riparian management areas that all have significant protective buffers. So the land management designations often reflect existing site conditions and can affect the trajectory of aquatic habitat change that we would imagine we would be able to detect over time. So the plan dramatically, as I mentioned, curtailed timber harvest and all that went along with timber harvest. So you can see in the graphic to the left that across the entire national forest system, after 1990, in the 1990s, when harvest in this western portion of the country declined, the amount of timber sold and harvested within the whole Forest Service as an agency dropped. And you can also see that in just the area of the Northwest Forest Plan over time. So the amount of harvest on Forest Service and federal land dropping significantly into the 90s and staying at a very low level. So this was a huge investment in terms of not harvesting. So a huge economic cost associated with not harvesting the trees in this area to allow for the reinvigoration and the recovery of systems. So now it's been 25 years. People are saying, can we start to see a change yet? I mean, this was a big effort across this whole area. What have we learned about this massive passive restoration effort that was really about just not doing what we've been doing before? So the Aquatic Riparian Effectiveness Monitoring Program, or AREMP, is the multi-agency monitoring program that is in place throughout, with monitoring sites throughout the area of the Northwest Forest Plan. Because this area encompasses such a broad area with incredible diversity of geomorphology and climate and forests, aquatic provinces are used in much of the reporting by the ARAMP program. So we've got the Olympic Peninsula in Washington and North Cascades, the Willamette, Puget Trough in Central Oregon, West Cascades, the coastal areas, and Northern California. What I want to show you here is a principal components analysis ordination of, and what the point here is to just look at the clustering of the dots based on these land use designations after 25 years of really not doing active timber harvest or use in these areas. And what we can see that across the entire area of the Northwest Forest Plan, areas that are those late successional reserve, those old growth areas, they're in green. Across the area of the Northwest Forest Plan, they're pretty well spread out in our ordination of similarity. The purple triangles are matrix lands. So those are the lands that had more timber harvest in the past and still have some harvest that occurs in them today. And then we have our congressional reserve areas, again, areas that are off limits. And what we see is that there's still differentiation between reserve areas and some of our matrix areas, but starting to see more overlap with across all of these different categories as time is going by. More so in some places than in others. So the Western Cascade province, we can see that the purple areas, so there's matrix lands where some harvest has occurred, a lot of harvest has occurred in the past, are still a bit different from our areas of late succession reserve, and the congressional reserve areas are quite different from matrix. But we're starting to see more overlap between these locations and those late successional reserves. So the bottom line here is that detectable improvement can take a long time, and it may take more time in some provinces than in others. So this is, again, a series of ordinations. And what I want you to look at here are the dots, like where are the dots clustered, the gray dots clustered close together or separately from the black, and where do they overlap? Because that's how we're comparing the samples that were taken at the beginning of this plan and the samples that were taken at the end of the time period. And what we're seeing is that some places like the Olympic Province and the Oregon Coast Range, we're starting to see that sites are different in time 2 than they were in time 1. We're starting to see differentiation in how these sites are related to one another. And this seems to be related to how quickly the forest is growing in these places and how badly over-harvested those sites were at the beginning. So both the forest in the Olympic Province and in the Oregon, Washington Coast Range, these are very fast-growing forests. So we can detect a change in these places more quickly than in many of the other provinces where we have much slower growing forest. So as you're starting to think about passive restoration, and in this case, a significant element of that passive restoration was just not doing a lot of the things we had been doing before, considering how quickly that system can change and recover is an important characteristic and something to keep in mind when you're identifying the goals and how long it's going to take for you to see the recovery that you're hoping to be able to see. We also found that, even in an area as broadly protected as we had with the Northwest Forest Plan, there are still, when you have passive restoration and you are still hoping for disturbance processes that will occur over time. One of the disturbance processes that we're seeing in the West that's occurring quite a bit is wildfire. So the amount and size of wildfire is changing, and So we're starting to see decreases in habitat quality over time. So seeing decreases in habitat quality over time in some regions, particularly those areas that are seeing wildfire, was not one of the big picture goals or outcomes that were anticipated under the aquatic conservation strategy, or this massive restoration experiment that is the Northwest Forest Plan. But we do know, and we recognize, that disturbance processes are really important in the long run. So the effect of are really important in the long run. And that's something that was captured really nicely by Bob Gresswell in 1999 in this figure looking at, in this case, the effect of wildfire. So how does wildfire affect aquatic systems? And time being such an important component of the effect of this potentially massive disturbance process on the landscape. So in the first few years post-fire, you can see declines in characteristics of stream habitat, with sediments, fine sediments, and decreased shade and increases in stream temperature. But over the longer run, these types of events that are associated with wildfire, like landslides and debris flows, they contribute those habitat forming sediments and wood that are critical for habitat complexity over the long run. So when we start to think about passive restoration and we start to think about natural processes, the time that it takes for natural processes to be able to occur and for them to be able to change conditions in our streams is really important. And that goes for the absence of some of our natural disturbance processes on the landscape. So I've been talking about having disturbance processes, but not having disturbance processes is also a disturbance on our system. So ecosystem engineers like beavers, and I know that there's going to be some more talks about beavers coming up, and that you have a lot more beavers out there, I think, than we do out here anymore. And we live in the beaver state. We're supposed to have a lot of beavers, but out here in the West and here in Oregon, beavers are still considered a rodent species and can be trapped, even though the science points to their incredibly important as engineers of complex habitat. Wildfire could be considered a disturbance. Not having beavers in systems that historically had beavers that contributed to floodplain complexity is a disturbance as well, of a different form. And I was going to say, yeah, there are bills that keep coming up and not getting through the legislature in Oregon to try to get beavers off the nuisance rodent list, and they keep failing. So I'm already up to my take-home messages, so I'm getting through this talk a little faster than I had thought. But I wanted to say that passive restoration is patient, and time is the most important element of this form of restoration. And passive restoration may be the only alternative when you're considering restoration at exceptionally large spatial extents. And as you're considering elements of passive restoration, even at small reach scale actions like with the riparian buffers and the cattle exclosures that I was mentioning earlier, the timeline to recovery really needs to be part of the consideration of the work. And detecting changes can be difficult, both for passive or active restoration. If we didn't have the monitoring that's been done through the AREMP program, we wouldn't be able to understand how different areas are recovering over the vast area of the Northwest Forest Plan. And that applies to small restoration projects as well. I know out here, monitoring dollars are really limited, and a lot of our granting organizations don't want money spent on monitoring. So we miss out. We don't collect data before restoration occurs, and we don't collect data after to really understand what the type of work that we're doing is affecting. And that can be particularly relevant when we're trying to understand work and restoration over longer timescales. So I came across this quote, and I thought it was really relevant thinking about passive restoration. And it's the idea that if anything is certain, it is that change is certain. So the world that we are planning today will not exist in this form tomorrow. Another way that I've heard this discussed in streams and for streams and fishes is the idea of resilience. Like, how do systems bounce back after change? Because we know change is going to be happening, and change has occurred. So why we try to make our restoration projects static doesn't seem consistent with how our natural systems work. And with that, I think I'm close to the end of time, and at least I'm out of slides. So I think I can open this up for any questions you might have. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. We do have time for questions here. So again, because we're all sort of family, if people do want to ask questions, they can unmute their mic. And Ray, I don't know if you had anything to comment to kick us off.
Yeah, well, thank you very, very much, Rebecca. Using the word passive, and well, it's obvious from what you said that when we do passive restoration, we should think that it's going to allow natural activity to keep happening, all those disturbances and everything. So the passiveness is ours, not nature's, right?
That is a really great way of placing that, Ray. That's exactly right.
Nature keeps acting and acting and acting, and we should let it. Yeah. Then
Yeah.
I was also my ears pricked up when you talked about long-term monitoring, and I was meaning to ask at first, who's going to pay for it, or who is willing to pay for it? But you more or less answered that. It's hard to get it paid for, right? And what agency or group, organization, philanthropic organization, whatever it is, has the patience to see it through. It's monitoring to evaluate what's being done is very expensive, and that's a constant problem that we have to face and make potential funders of projects aware that it's necessary. Scientists who look at stream restoration, look at the history of stream restoration and so on, are forever criticizing us in restoration for not monitoring, for not evaluating, but they don't say where to get the money for it. Yeah, and they probably haven't been through it themselves. So I wanted to make that point.
No, I think that's a really important point. And there are some, one thing that's been incredibly useful. So for the Northwest Forest Plan, AREMP is the monitoring arm. It's an expensive program, but it's funded from several different federal sources. And something that's really useful about that kind of a monitoring program is the consistency of the data collection across a very, very broad spatial extent. So I've worked in other efforts where monitoring is done more ad hoc or with different groups. And it's very hard to be able to pull that information together in a way to be able to understand what that type of restoration is doing when everybody's using different methods and different techniques. So as you're saying, the funding organizations out there don't really want to support monitoring. It would be great if the funding organizations could mandate the specific type and method for monitoring that needs to occur. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can take some time. And a lot of the practitioners that I've worked with in the field are more than happy to do the monitoring if they just have that relatively small amount of resources to be able to go out and to do the temperature monitoring or do the simplified habitat cross sections that they need to, or whatever that is. But that standardization of the method, I think, is really important.
So we're into our break time now of 5 minutes, but we can keep on talking, and anybody who wants to take a break can go ahead and do it. Mark Beardsley has a chat question up there. He says, I think that, quote, exceptionally large spatial extents, unquote, are what we need to make a real difference. This type of passive restoration is crucial. And Kevin Graham makes a comment here. Thank you for your research and words, Rebecca. I will be along the Oregon coast near Lincoln City next week. Is there any of your work in that area that I might visit and see the work done? You got something going on there?
Well, I don't, but I know a few people who do, and there's some interesting floodplain restoration that Kevin might be interested in. So Kevin, if you could just send me an email, I can connect you with the folks out there.
And Chris Jordan submits the comment that support for monitoring for restoration is a hard sell because restoration funding entities believe that restoration practitioners know what they are doing, and that it is beneficial. So data collection isn't necessary. We need to reframe the conversation that actions are part of an experiment that allows learning. Great comment. And I would add to that it's especially hard to get funding and time to do the pre-treatment monitoring, because people might give money for a project and they don't want to wait to have it start. Yeah. And ideally, in most projects, you need at least 5 years of monitoring before the project in order to see what the stream ecosystem or even just the fish population is doing. Yeah. And very few people have ever had the luxury of that. There's one study in Wisconsin that did, because they were working on something else first and they got the pre-data that they needed.
Got a couple of folks looking to ask questions here, and I'll turn the mic over to Carl. Carl has a question.
Yeah, this is Carl Kohler out of Minnesota. And my question's, I think, sort of similar to what Faith was asking before and how some of this fits into regulations. For example, the Water Quality Act requires that states address like TMDLs for excess sediment. And I was just recently looking at a study in Iowa where they had a paired watershed study where they converted 15% of the watershed back to prairie and to a wildlife management area, I believe it was, whereas the other watershed actually increased in row cropping 10% over that time period, yet they were unable to detect any reduction in sediment export because the majority of the sediment was coming from stream banks in this system as the channel was going through a channel evolution process. So the time frame for the change was going to be however long it took for that stream to go through that channel evolution process, which isn't really fitting into the time frame that the Water Quality Act is looking for. So do you see situations like that where it makes sense to possibly do active restoration when you understand those causes, or is it a situation where you think that we need to re-examine the way our water quality rules are written?
Can you make a short answer, Rebecca? We're about out of time here. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would say that I think very often our TMDL and other restrictive measures they don't account for natural processes. It can be a really important, this is a huge issue, I think, particularly for natural process active restoration, like what Mark was talking about, where disturbance, and you're needing, in some cases, you're needing to create active disturbance in these systems in order to change recovery trajectories in the streams. And this is a challenge that we have. I don't have a solution for it, but it's definitely a problem within the regulatory framework.
Okay, thank you very, very much, everybody. And I'm trying to share my screen again. Eric, you're going to have to coach me again. I pressed share. There must be something else I have to press. Eric, are you hearing me?
Yep. Did you start with the green button on the Zoom screen?
Yep.
Sorry. There you go.
Are we there? Okay.
Yep. Now you got to skip ahead.
So I'm pressing the skip button and it doesn't skip. Oh, there we are. Okay. Anyway, for future reference, there are the references from Rebecca's talk.
And we can email those out to everybody.
Yeah, and they'll be there. I hope they'll be there if you go into the recording too. Yeah, do it both ways. Good idea.